So if you want to find Dr. Sam Bailey's full videos, I'm sure if you guys are familiar with Odyssey, you can just go on there and check her out. Dr. Sam Bailey should be like the first person that pops up. Let's go.
Hey guys, I've continued to receive so many questions about COVID-19, and one that frequently comes up is that of asymptomatic transmission. Those of you that are familiar with my work know that I like to analyse the evidence and go right back to basic scientific principles. Hence, I find the concept of asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19 strange from the start, because no one has even demonstrated symptomatic transmission in a valid experiment. But a microbiologist here in New Zealand has shown me his correspondence with our health authorities as they try to justify the concept of asymptomatic transmission and population-wide controls. Let's see what they've got.
Back in 2020, I posted on my Facebook to friends and family that is not real. The title of the video is not real, and that we were being scammed. And funnily enough, a lot of people that haven't spoken to me for ages and all kinds of different people started coming out of the woodwork, even in my private messages, saying, "Don't be ridiculous. I'm this and I'm that, and I know this and I know that, and you just, you're not a doctor, and this is dangerous and whatnot." And we're now in 2025, and I still have the same opinion. Hasn't really been demonstrated, at least to me. If someone has the information that can educate me, that would prove that this thing is real, I would love to see something definitive. But let's carry on.
This idea, for example, that you can be ill even though you have no symptoms, and you can be a respiratory virus threat to someone else even though you have no symptoms, that's also invented in 2020. There's simply no history of it, and it defies common sense as well.
I've recently been in communication with Dr. Robin Wakeling, a veteran microbiologist here in New Zealand, who has been previously involved in the development of PCR and forensic analysis. Dr. Wakeling has been concerned that, like many governments, the New Zealand government has been using claims of asymptomatic transmission to justify measures such as lockdowns against entire populations.
The funny thing as well is that illness is essentially the manifestation of symptoms, and the symptoms don't have to be, physical pain or whatnot, but there's something observable in order for someone to classify someone as ill, and that thing being observable is more than just a test saying positive. It should be something that you can actually examine within the human body, or you can objectively see, or some objective symptom that the person has, to my understanding. So the idea that you can be sick but not be sick is surely in itself paradoxical. But the experts, so-called experts, or the learned individuals would have us believe that we somehow don't understand it, and that this oxymoron stands to be simultaneously sick but asymptomatic is quite something.
Dr. Wakeling is a true scientist and has been putting the uncomfortable but crucial questions to the New Zealand health authorities. He's had some rather interesting responses to date, and we'll put these under the spotlight today. By definition, a virus is an infectious particle, and in the case of COVID-19, it is claimed by authorities that it passes between people whether they are symptomatic or asymptomatic. This has been the justification for lockdowns, face masks, and mass quarantines. But if the PCR test is not valid for detecting infection in this regard, then how is it being used to demonstrate any kind of transmission at all? If you've seen some of my previous videos or read Virus Mania, you'll see the reasons we give for why PCR tests do not detect an infection per se. They simply detect genetic fragments, and although they might be good at this, further conclusions about what this detection means are limited in this setting. Unfortunately, they were declared a gold standard by unscientific circular reasoning. A test so good it was claimed that it validated itself. Perhaps.
It's very strange as well. I've had this argument on live so many times where I try to mention that these fragments that are detected are also not a sign that a person can be sick, because the very idea of asymptomatic and testing positive means that the fragments can be present but that you are not sick, thereby falsifying in and of itself the idea that the fragment being present means that you are going to be sick. In other words, the fact that you can be asymptomatic in and of itself means that the test isn't testing for whether you're actually sick or not. It's testing, again, for these fragments. And if the presence of the fragments doesn't mean that you're sick, then how are you assigning causality between the fragments' presence and your symptoms, if they do arise, or indeed to any kind of mortality? In the case of my daughter, she had this test without our consent. They, supposedly have now detected fragments, and then they've now assigned this as her cause of death. The presence of these fragments, even though we've all observed what her cause of death was. So there is definitely fraud involved in this, and it's just funny to me that worldwide, such a small number of people question these things, especially when it comes to this test, because it is effectively the only variable that matters. If that's what they are in determining if there was fraud in this whole thing, because the test is the thing that people are using to determine the widespread numbers of incidents of this thing, and it's also what they're using to determine, for the most part, whether people died of this thing. And so, if the test is not reliable, then all the numbers must be amended in tandem with the reliability of the test. In other words, if the test is 90% reliable, then 10% of those numbers probably should get shaved off. If the test is 50% reliable, then 50% of those numbers can get shaved off. And if the test is 1% reliable, then nobody really effectively or virtually nobody would have even really had this thing, and it could be chalked down to simple error. In other words, it would not even be statistically significant if the test was that improper or inaccurate, which, again, just by virtue of it testing for genetic fragments as opposed to something tangible that correlates directly with a person having symptoms, it thereby is unreliable, in my opinion.
After convincing people of this, some thought that they could go even further and make their claims for asymptomatic transmission. Anyway, Dr. Wakeling is also fully aware of the limitations of what we can interpret from PCR, as has been fully apparent from my conversations with him and the way he words his questions to the authorities. In fact, with regards to PCR results, he issued the following warning to the government. The media is reporting positive PCR test results as new cases of COVID-19. Could you please explain why such a basic and critical error remains unchecked by government policy? And now let's explore how else he put the New Zealand authorities on the spot, including the responses that he received. One of the questions Dr. Wakeling put to Prime Minister Ardern and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, New Zealand's Director General of Health, on February 15th regarding an urgent response was as follows. Please provide references for any publications that establish a precedent for isolating populations of asymptomatic, healthy people to control spread of infectious disease. Now, as you might expect, the Prime Minister and Dr. Bloomfield did not respond personally to the question. Dr. Wakeling informs me the Prime Minister...
In other words, it shows something that proves that the presence of this antigen particle inherently makes a person infectious, thereby necessitating that they must quarantine simply because this fragment was detected on them. And it also begs the question, how are you proving that this fragment is indeed contagious?
Minister's office forwarded the question to Chris Hipkins, the COVID-19 response minister, but his office said that it wasn't his job and forwarded it to the Ministry of Health. Dr. Wakeling finally received an email almost 3 weeks later from the Response and Coordination Team, COVID-19 Health System Response. So firstly, it is a rather slow response for an urgent request. Shouldn't the authorities have all their information at their fingertips for their taxpayers and citizens, particularly when it has been the basis for such severe nationwide restrictions? Hopefully there was a good reason for their delay.
Almost every night here there's a wine tasting party.
In any case, let's take a look at how they responded and the evidence they cited for their position. Firstly, they state that most SARS-CoV-2 transmission is spread by people who display some symptoms. However, asymptomatic people also play a role in transmission.
Okay, so we would need to know what percentages as well. That's really interesting. So most is spread by people who display symptoms. However, asymptomatic play a role in transmission. However, the majority of cases, it depends on the estimates you see. I've seen estimates that are 30%. I've seen estimates that are 60% of what percentage of C19 cases were actually symptomatic versus asymptomatic. If they're saying it's mostly spread by people who display symptoms, well, if only 40% of people display symptoms, then doesn't that mean that, what percentage of people who are asymptomatic are involved in the spread? And then indeed, is there a percentage of asymptomatic people who don't play a role in transmission? Or do all of them play a role in transmission? It's strange. Would this supposedly be to do with viral load or...
And the reference for this is a WHO page that doesn't exist. Okay, they've given a dud link, but if we search the terms, we find that this must be what they are referring to. Now, this appears to be smoke and mirrors. This is not a scientific source document, but a consensus document that is unreferenced, and we are concerned that the ministry is referring to opinions that were put together in early 2020 when far less information was available. In any case, the document provides no evidence about isolating healthy asymptomatic people, and in fact states that asymptomatic infections do not appear to be a major driver of transmission. So reference number 1 is a fail with regards to providing the evidence they claim.
Well, essentially, it is saying that it's not a major driver, which means that it makes some contribution, but not all the contribution. And the inference there is that symptomatic transmissions make the majority of the contribution. So it's not exactly that they're failing, it's just that that statement in and of itself has no proof even in the source document.
Next, the response team states that it is believed that between 17 and 20% of infections are asymptomatic, and they give 2 references. These are actual scientific papers, so at least we might be getting somewhere. Let's have a look at the first reference. You'll see on reading this paper that there are problems all over the place, including numerous modelling assumptions. They say that transmission of asymptomatic infection were estimated to be 6% and 69%, and the credibility of most modelling studies was limited by the absence of external validation. At least the authors admit that most included studies were not designed to estimate the proportion of asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infections and were at risk of selection biases. So the Ministry of Health is...
And this is a meta-analysis as well. And the issue with meta-analysis is that you're introducing so many different studies with different sources, different methodologies, and you're controlling for certain variables, which if the study is not designed to account for certain outcomes, like for example, the asymptomatic spread numbers, there can be overlaps that are fatal to the reliability of a meta-analysis. You'll find that doctors tend to just think, oh, you know, if something's meta-analysis, if something's Cochrane review, that it means that, you know, this is the gold standard. But there's a lot of inherent problems in just bundling a lot of studies together that oftentimes themselves are not even reliable, in order to extrapolate or extricate claims that the studies themselves are not even set up to examine. So that's why, like they're saying, they can't even find a proper conclusion with regards to asymptomatic spread from that meta-analysis, because they said the studies were not set up to look for it conveniently. So, you know, you've got these sources on government health websites making definitive claims that probably other people will rely on based on appeals to authority, and they are not even themselves doing the due diligence to ensure that their sources and indeed that the sources of those sources, in other words, the actual studies, are controlling for the ideas or examining the outcomes that they are presenting on their official government websites. In other words, the source is bullshit.
Referring to a paper that provides no actual evidence of asymptomatic transmission. It's simply speculation based on modelling and an assumption that anyone with a positive PCR is infected. The next reference is just as bad. Another retrospective analysis looking at just 5 selected studies. I found it amusing that they cited this paper though. The authors reported that 1 new case resulted from 305 close contacts of asymptomatic source cases, 0.3%.
Let me guess, some kind of epidemiological model that they've used yet again to determine this.
Even on accepting all the unsubstantiated premises of COVID-19 and how it is diagnosed, 1 case or 0.3% would surely be considered a margin of error result. Now, the ministry don't seem to understand the difference between analytical and diagnostic specificity. So maybe they should watch my video, COVID-19 Behind the PCR Curtain, to get...
I'm surprised you didn't even bring up the fact that how did they even come to that conclusion? I guarantee you it's some kind of epidemiological model yet again.
...to grips with this. Even with their misunderstanding, they would still have to accept that 1 out of 305 could be a false positive. In any case, it doesn't bode well for building their case for asymptomatic transmission. Next, the response team states that people can also transmit SARS-CoV-2 when they are pre-symptomatic, as levels of virus in the body multiply before the onset of symptoms. Wow, that's a huge claim, and I don't know how they plan to back this one up. Not looking promising for them with this first citation because the methodology in the study is clustering. As you may know, we exposed the problem of using clustering in the latest edition of Virus Mania. It may give investigators some leads, but is in no way actual evidence that transmission has taken place. The clusters described in this particular study include people who went to the same church at...
Exactly, epidemiological model. So again, this is my issue with the primary study that was used to determine that there could potentially be a pandemic, is that they just looked at people who had been on the same plane, who had the same symptoms. In other words, they found some kind of correlation and then extrapolated that not even extrapolated, they just speculated that, that this could be caused by something. And then they put the cart before the horse, started looking for something, found some similar genetic material in these individuals, and then did an isolation to accommodate for why those, to try and find similar artifacts within those samples. And then they've then looked at their database and gone, these artifacts, which we've basically created through this isolation process, are similar to something else that we found a few years back. It's almost like genetic material that you isolate from individuals oftentimes has large regions that are not dissimilar. And then when you've then got these artifacts that are somewhat similar, you can't account for why they're not exactly the same as the other things in your database. So then you say, it's a new strain. I mean, it's impossible for you to ever be wrong then. Every time something, you do the isolation, 50%, yeah, 50% similar. 90%, yeah, it's a new strain, 10% difference. Just, you can't lose. Everything you find in your little sampling is going to have some similarity to another, genetic sequence, especially if it's come from organic material. So in my opinion, much of this is a farce, but I'm happy to be educated.
At different times. Fatally for this paper, it states that all cases in this report were confirmed by polymerase chain reaction only. Asymptomatic persons were not routinely tested. Okay, so the case definition is simply a positive PCR test, but people without symptoms were not being tested, so we have no control group as such. Hence...
Yeah, no control group for the people without symptoms. So then how can you know what percentage of people without symptoms are asymptomatic people and what percentage are simply just people that are not positive cases? You're just, again, speculating.
There's complete speculation that is being employed rather than the scientific method. Okay, on to the second reference they provide for their big claim. This one looks suspicious from the outset. I have looked at other papers comparing PCR results and days of illness, and they are all over the place. Detected one day, then not the next. In fact, as a little segue, this paper came out in early 2020, and as you can see, even hospitalised cases of claimed COVID-19 have PCR results that look like a drunkard's walk. Half the time, the PCR results were negative, and they could oscillate between negative and positive within 24 hours. You'll also see that most so-called positives required cycle thresholds above 30. Do they have COVID-19 one day and then not the next? Which results are we supposed to use? But going back to the response team's citation, our authors have produced a smooth line purporting to show viral load being highest at the start of the illness and then decaying away. Now, I don't believe there is evidence that allows you to conclude cycle thresholds equate to so-called viral load. Again, that is beyond what PCR does, although you'll often see this claim. However, let's accept the premise and analyse it from there. Can you see a problem on the charts? There are virtually no cycle threshold data points for the first few days, which has highly skewed the data, and many subsequent thresholds are actually very erratic. Others have already noted this, and in response...
You can even tell by just looking at that the data is not uniform in any way, shape, or form.
To the study, two critiquing analysts pointed out that the authors proposed that virus titers would peak at or prior to symptom onset. However, visual inspection of individual viral load tracings appears to refute this interpretation.
If you have a high viral load but you're asymptomatic, isn't the inference there that the higher your viral load, the more symptomatic you'd be? So why would you have a really high viral load and be asymptomatic? And then if that's the case, then is that someone who's immune? And if they're immune, they would still have a positive test, a high viral load, but then they're considered to have C19.
They also commented that a request for viral shedding data was denied by the Guangzhou 8th People's Hospital. They go on to point out that studies modelling would predict that infectiousness is low at the time of symptom onset, but continuously increases to infinity with increasing time before symptom onset, which is not a plausible infectiousness profile. Did the ministry even look properly at this poor quality paper, which has been shown to make implausible claims? Could it be they are just reading the abstracts without further analysis? And why would they claim it provides the evidence that Dr. Wakeling requested?
They haven't actually even established that you can spread the thing. And then they're making an assumption within an assumption by saying that once you're asymptomatic, the first assumption, you're spreading it, the second assumption. And then it's actually a third assumption, because then they're actually saying that the amount that you spread it increases based on your viral load. But that's not even what the thing shows. It's just complete nonsense. And that's the source of a source on a government website.
He certainly wasn't fooled by their citations and sent them the following response. I checked 4 of the sentence citation combinations at random, and I cannot find any specific link between the citation and the sentence to which it is attached, a basic requirement of Level 2 NCEA science. For those of you outside New Zealand, that is high school level science. My personal thoughts on asymptomatic transmission is that it has been promoted alongside a dazzling array of buzzwords and mantras such as flatten the curve, social distancing, super spreaders, and so forth. All of them have had dramatic effects in scaring people into compliance, but have no sound scientific basis in how they have been applied with the current situation. Asymptomatic transmission may also have been used as a convenient explanation after the fact. For example, when a new case seems to pop out of nowhere. There are other explanations, but I guess they don't conform to the narrative.
Also, it means that if a person is a false positive, you don't know if they're a false positive or an asymptomatic case, which is a fundamental flaw to the concept. You'd have to know exactly to what extent a person could be a false positive versus an asymptomatic case. And I don't believe there's been anything that I've seen that compares those two phenomena. And so for all we know, all the asymptomatic cases could just be false positives, which again, as I said at the start of the video, could reduce the numbers by 50% or more. Who knows? Many people know kind of my thoughts on these topics already. I know that I'm speaking to a new audience every time I make a video, and potentially 5 people or 500, or maybe one day 5,000, 10,000. So I can't assume that people know my thoughts, but I will continue to respond and react to videos like this on my Telegram, where I can speak more freely. I chose kind of a milquetoast topic of Sam Bailey's to discuss, purely because I'm speaking on YouTube and perhaps the censors won't pick up too much on the concept that we're talking about and whether it's medical misinformation. We're not really, myself, Dr. Bailey, individuals that speak on this topic, we're not really spreading information. We're more challenging information. So I don't see how it could be medical misinformation. But such is the landscape now when you discuss these kind of topics. Thank you for watching. Appreciate it.